Billions of dollars set aside for needy children allegedly stolen from Minnesota taxpayers. Instead, it was used for lavish vacations and properties abroad. Several federal agencies now say they are getting involved.
Imagine at 7 o'clock in the morning in Minnesota, inspectors step into a government-funded daycare, but instead of the joyful laughter of children, they encounter an eerie silence along with a safe containing $30 million. But that's just the beginning. From what seemed like a simple welfare fraud case, agents inadvertently uncovered an entire underground empire operating on an industrial scale right in the heart of America. How could such a gigantic criminal network hide so perfectly under the guise of charity for so many years? The truth behind that door is likely to send chills down your spine. It seems like a massive large-scale fraud scandal is gradually coming to light in Minnesota. Billions of dollars are alleged to have been funneled through a vast network of front businesses, activated and sustained under the guise of social welfare programs. The financial scale of it is so enormous that according to some comparisons, it is nearly on par with the GDP of an entire small country like Somalia. Billions of dollars intended specifically for poor children, are accused of having been stolen from Minnesota taxpayers. Instead, this money appears to have been used for lavish vacations and purchasing overseas real estate. Well, right now, some federal agencies say they are starting to get involved. This isn't random misuse. It seems to be a well-coordinated pipeline of public funds, approved, processed, and distributed through the state systems, allowing organized fraud to expand unchecked for many years. Let me tell you this detail. At 7:18 in the morning in Minneapolis, the cold winter air was, quiet when DHS inspectors arrived at a child care facility registered under the name Hale Lima Ibrahim Guled, 46 years old. On paper, the place served dozens of children each week. But when the door opened, the building was completely silent. No children, no parents, no staff, just a lone security guard sitting in the empty lobby. The playrooms remained intact. Dust covered the toys, cribs that had never been used, charts that had never been written on. It was a daycare that seemed to have never existed. Inside Hale Lima's office, investigators reportedly found something far more alarming: a file folder containing a fraud list of more than 700 children. Names repeated, signatures copied, attendance records fabricated. Then they opened the steel safe. Inside, rumors say there were 6 tightly wrapped black packages, next to them a colossal stack of cash, sealed and stacked, with the figure mentioned being $30 million. At that moment, what began as a welfare fraud inspection seemed to turn into the scene of a serious federal case. By the afternoon, investigators had expanded their search across all of Minneapolis, and the deeper they looked, the stranger this pattern became. Records showed that Hale Lima Ibrahim Guled didn't just run one daycare. She was listed as director of 6 different facilities, each approved for 30 to 40 registered children, all receiving government child care subsidies. But field visits seemed to reveal the same repeated truth. No children, no teachers, no activities, just paperwork. Financial ledgers had tracked millions of dollars in subsidies flowing through ghost accounts, transferred between service agencies, community programs, and private money transfer transactions that never matched attendance records. The numbers, did not suggest mere poor management. They seemed to point to a system deliberately built to harvest public funds. And then came the most alarming duplication. Many transactions linked these daycare entities to out-of-state transfers and overseas remittance centers, mirroring patterns that had already been flagged in other federal investigations. What began as a single fraud operation had quietly grown into an organized statewide network. By the time investigators followed the final financial trail, information indicated that Hale Lima Ibrahim Guled was already at the port of Houston, stepping aboard a private vessel quietly heading toward the Gulf. She was leaving the country. As the ship moved into open water, Coast Guard surveillance confirmed its southward course. Federal pursuit vessels trailed from a distance, closing the gap through the dark, silent waves until the horizon narrowed and there was nowhere left to run. The interception unfolded calmly and decisively. Hale Lima was detained on deck, her escape ending at sea. What had started as welfare fraud appeared to have escalated into a full federal pursuit across open water. Do you think she was acting alone, or was she just one piece of something much larger? 11:46 at night. Data extracted from Hale Lima's seized devices led investigators to an allegedly abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of Minneapolis. But, well, it was anything but abandoned. The compound was under heavy guard. Cameras swept endlessly, and inside those walls, the truth was utterly astonishing. Overhead, scans revealed 4 production floors operating at full capacity around the clock. The machinery never stopped. Output moved in relentless cycles. The logs appeared to indicate industrial-scale production of prohibited substances. According to the recorded figures, there were up to nearly 20 tons of fentanyl per day and more than 60 tons of cocaine. A toxic supply large enough to devastate entire wide regions. And those numbers were just the beginning. Behind those doors were 52 people held captive, including American citizens and foreign nationals, under surveillance, control, and suspected of being subjected to forced labor. Some had been missing for many months. Others had vanished without a trace. All of them were right there, inside this factory that was never meant to be found. By the time the coordinated federal task force assembled, the night sky was alive with urgency. More than 200 federal agents moved in synchronized formation across perimeter security lines. Every movement was calculated, every decision weighed against the lives trapped inside. There was no room for error. Teams divided up, some for the breach, some for hostage rescue, others to block potential escape routes. Silence thickened the air as the final countdown began. The pressure built like a weight deep in the marrow of the bones. 12:17 in the morning. Headlights sliced across the compound. Sirens shattered the night. Voices echoed in controlled commands as breach points were forced open and agents poured inside. The silent factory erupted into chaos. Alarms blared, footsteps thundered through metal corridors, the sharp collision of fear and adrenaline. The hostages were found in separate rooms, exhausted, terrified, but mercifully still alive. Rescue teams guided them out in waves, step by step, voice by voice, forming protective corridors as they moved through the complex. Some wept, some collapsed, some whispered that they had believed they would never see daylight again. But now they were going home. Inside the compound, resistance intensified, panic cracking through the carefully constructed shadows of the network. The confrontation thundered off the steel walls like rolling thunder. Get the hostages out. Protect every life. Hold the formation. 1:42 in the morning. By the end of the night, the compound was secured. The lights that once concealed the silence were now replaced by flashing emergency beacons and rescue medical personnel. Evidence rooms were sealed, ledgers, devices, documents, shipping manifests, all fully preserved, and the final truth stood plainly in view. What had begun as a daycare investigation had led to an underground industrial empire laid bare in the dead of night. 4:12 in the morning. An industrial corridor in Minneapolis. The factory was no longer a fortress. Headlights swept across the concrete yard, reflecting off emergency vehicles and rescue tents as federal personnel moved with controlled urgency. The chaos of the night had shifted into something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that follows shock rather than peace. The hostages had been brought out in stages. Now came the part no one prepares for. What happens after survival? Medical teams moved between triage stations, checking vital signs, warming hands, stabilizing exhaustion. Some of the rescued individuals sat wrapped in thermal blankets, staring down at the ground as if the world around them was too bright to process. Others clung to first responders, whispering fragments of their stories, the places where they were taken, the promises that had been made to them, the moment they realized they were never meant to leave. One man, barely able to speak, kept repeating the same words over and over. "I thought no one would ever find us." At 4:28 in the morning, identification units began recording names, cross-checking against missing persons reports from multiple states and foreign agencies. Matches appeared one after another. People from Minnesota, Washington, Texas, as well as several countries overseas. Some had been reported missing many months earlier. Others had vanished quietly without any explanation. Families who believed they would never get answers suddenly had one, and it was right here inside this building. The evidence response teams moved into the intersections of the compound, no longer as rescuers, but now as chroniclers of the crime. Each room held, another piece of the story. Ledgers stacked in metal cabinets, shipping schedules pinned to corkboards, computer terminals still logged into the internal network. Nothing about this place was improvised. It was systematic, structured, engineered to operate invisibly for as long as possible. Financial ledgers had mapped transfers across multiple states. The transaction chains led back to front organizations tied to child care service providers that existed only on paper. Some entries traced directly to business fronts connected to the network of Hail Lima Ibrahim Guled. What had started as a daycare subsidy fraud scheme appeared to have evolved into a financial engine fueling something far larger. 5:06 in the morning. Federal analysts joined the on-site assessment. Patterns emerged quickly: synchronized payments, regular reimbursement cycles, names repeated across multiple daycare registries. On every page, the same haunting question lingered. How long had this system operated undetected? No one answered, but the numbers did, and they were truly staggering. Can you believe that a ghost daycare could so easily siphon tens of millions of dollars right under the authorities' noses? 5:31 in the morning. The final sweep confirmed that the interior was secure. Evidence crates, sealed with chains, were loaded for transport. Devices were tagged for forensic recovery. Communication logs, personnel lists, and shipping manifests were all fully preserved. Nothing would disappear. Nothing would be rewritten. The factory that once concealed silence now held the most complete record ever uncovered of the network. As dawn broke over the horizon, the industrial skyline softened into pale blue. The tension of the night faded into weary relief. Not a victory, but an acknowledgement of what had been stopped. The hostages were safe. The compound had fallen. But the investigators, knew something else. This place was not the beginning. It seemed to be merely one node in a structure that stretched far beyond Minnesota. A system built on fraud, intimidation, and exploitation. And now that it had been exposed, the rest of the network would no longer remain silent. 7:14 in the morning. Federal Operations Center, Minneapolis. As the sun rose over the city, the factory no longer stood as a mystery. It stood as a starting point. Inside the temporary command room, screens glowed with documents, maps, and financial charts pulled from the compound. For the first time, investigators could see the network in full motion. And it didn't begin in Minneapolis. It passed through there. On one digital screen, analysts reconstructed currency trails that stretched across 3 states, weaving between nonprofit records, child care service contracts, and child care subsidy deposits that never matched physical attendance logs. Reimbursement cycles appeared rhythmically every 2 weeks, every quarter, every financial closeout period. It was not random, it seemed engineered with precision. Names repeated across multiple registries, addresses recycled between agencies, supervisors listed as staff in one ledger and as guardians in another. Each document looked legitimate on its own. Together they formed a structure. 7:41 in the morning. A second layer of data was added. The shipping manifest from the industrial compound connected to warehouse records in Houston, Phoenix, and Southern California, with outbound routes extending toward maritime channels and cross-border transit hubs. Minneapolis was not the end of the chain. It was a midpoint, a place where the paper trail converged, where assistance programs became conversion points, where benefits intended for families were funneled through front entities and repackaged into financial streams that no longer resembled public aid. What had begun as daycare fraud appeared to have evolved into a full logistics economy. 8:03 in the morning. The name Hail Lima Ibrahim Guled appeared across multiple nodes, not just as director, but as guarantor, financial signatory, a silent partner on accounts that never recorded payroll, personnel, or basic operating expenses. 6 daycare facilities, dozens of reimbursement filings, yet no consistent record of children ever attending. Still, the numbers climbed month after month. Federal analysts overlaid immigration investigation files. Patterns emerged once again. Individuals tied to her network surfaced as caregivers on one form, counselors on another, temporary contractors on a third. Some had entered the United States only recently. 8:28 in the morning. Cross-border financial surveillance confirmed that portions of the diverted funds had been routed through intermediary accounts linked to overseas remittance corridors, the exact same channels previously scrutinized in earlier federal cases involving organized crime syndicates. The network wasn't just moving people, it was moving capital and leverage. Each layer concealed another beneath it. Each connection masked the one that followed. 8:52 in the morning. A single phrase passed through the operations room. This was never about a facility. The investigators were no longer talking about locations. They were talking about clusters, routes, functional layers. Minneapolis stored the paper architecture. Houston handled transportation. Other areas supported distribution and concealment. This empire did not resemble a hierarchy, it resembled a spider web. And the spider web had quietly, efficiently expanded over many years beneath programs built on trust, relief, and goodwill, until a silent daycare unraveled the first thread. The case files were consolidated, the general task authorizations were expanded, multiple federal agencies synchronized their timelines, financial crimes, organized fraud, interstate movement, and cross-border coordination. The mission was no longer about shutting down one facility. It was about pulling the map apart thread by thread, exposing every connection, every node, without letting the rest slip back into silence once more. Because the factory had revealed the truth. This network did not collapse overnight. It was built with patience, hidden within paperwork, wrapped in legality, and spread across borders until the morning the final light finally reached it. By the time the investigation reached the final press conference, the mood inside the federal building was neither celebratory nor relieved. It was solemn. The documents that had triggered everything now lay in the center of the table. A registry listing more than 700 children, licenses for 6 daycare facilities, months of reimbursement records, signatures, approvals, regular payment cycles, all formatted, processed, and authenticated to perfection. On paper, the system looked healthy. In reality, there was almost no evidence that any of the children listed had ever stepped through those doors. No parents waited outside, no sounds of children playing. The operation did not pretend to thrive. It was designed to go unnoticed. The analysts had reached a stark realization. This fraud was never meant to impress. It was meant to appear routine. Forms were submitted on schedule. Attendance sheets mirrored each other month after month. Compliance boxes were checked exactly as expected. Nothing bold, nothing loud, just enough predictability to glide through government systems built on efficiency and trust. It was not carelessness that allowed it to function. Perhaps it was the very absence of suspicion. As the policy teams and financial crimes units examined the broader impacts, the conversation shifted away from money and toward consequences. The damage was not limited to the amount stolen. It reached real families who depended on the support programs, communities already skeptical of institutions, and honest childcare providers whose reputations were now shrouded in suspicion. What the network exploited was not a financial vulnerability, it exploited public trust. The procedural gaps emerged in slow, uncomfortable clarity. Approvals were granted without on-site verification. Digital documentation was accepted as proof of reality. The records were authenticated through repetition rather than observation. The network did not hide behind threats or chaos. It hid behind paperwork that appeared perfectly legitimate, and legitimacy, once assumed, is rarely challenged. At the end of the review, one conclusion stood above every other finding. This was not simply a fraud scheme, it was an ecosystem, a living thing embedded within social programs, moving through bureaucratic structures and growing in silence because no one imagined that organized criminal infrastructure could exist behind something labeled as support for children. The daycare doors were never opened for families. They had been built as a shield. When political systems prioritize efficiency over oversight, and when programs created to protect the vulnerable become conduits for those willing to exploit trust on a massive scale, the political fallout echoed far beyond Minnesota. Lawmakers were being forced to explain how billions of dollars in public support could flow through approval systems without any physical verification. Committees were demanding answers from the agencies that had signed off on facilities that never housed children, programs that never delivered services, and repeating reimbursement cycles that went unquestioned for years. This scandal was not merely financial, it was institutional. It challenged the way governments audit themselves, the way welfare programs are overseen, and the very definition of accountability when fraud hides within the cloak of legitimacy. The human cost reached even further. Every dollar diverted through fraud was a dollar taken from real families who desperately needed the support, from parents working 2 jobs, from legitimate child care providers struggling to keep their doors open. The network did not just steal money, it stole opportunity, reputation, and public trust. And for the 52 individuals found inside that facility, the price was not measured in numbers, but in time, fear, and survival. The biggest lesson from this story is the need for vigilance toward anything that merely appears legitimate. We tend to assume that child support programs or social welfare initiatives are inherently safe, but in reality, blind trust without verification is the very gap that organized crime exploits for profit. Perhaps each of us needs to actively observe and speak up when we notice unusual signs right in our own communities. Don't let indifference unintentionally become the shield that allows large-scale fraud networks to persist. This case goes far beyond the stolen financial figures. It serves as a painful wake-up call about the collapse of trust itself. From ghost daycares to hidden factories, we witness the exorbitant cost of management that relies solely on paperwork while lacking any real verification. How many more networks like this are still lurking right in front of us, undetected? In your opinion, what needs to change immediately? Far stricter inspection procedures or truly fitting punishment for the officials who deliberately turned a blind eye? Please leave your thoughts below, because silence sometimes is the greatest accomplice of all.